These are the final days of the largest armored stockpile ever assembled on Earth. As of early 2026, the number of modern T-90 tanks left in Russian reserve storage bases hit exactly 0. That total depletion forced a complete reliance on active production lines to replace battlefield losses. Satellite analysis from June 9, 2026, confirmed the broader reserve dwindled to just 2,088 total tanks across 9 storage bases, exposing a severe weakness that foreign intelligence agencies are tracking closely. That represents a substantial collapse from a pre-war stockpile of over 7,300 units. The Soviet inheritance is finally running dry. The military machine is adapting its strategy to survive the shortage, which dictates the future of the war. The transition away from Cold War reserves changes how battles are fought today. The scale of the drawdown reveals a logistics network stretched to its limit, forcing commanders to rethink their entire approach to mechanized warfare. Planners in Moscow can no longer point to endless rows of surplus armor to intimidate adversaries. The satellite imagery proves the metal is gone. The collapse of this stockpile changes everything. Subscribe to this channel and you'll start noticing how many historical shifts like this happen right under your nose. The reality of this equipment drought became undeniable in August 2025. Armored vehicle researcher Andriy Tarasenko analyzed promotional footage from the Uralvagonzavod tank plant and spotted something particularly unusual. Workers were fitting a 45-year-old T-72A tank with advanced relict reactive armor. Production ran from 1979 to 1985. Upgrading them revealed to the world that Russia had completely exhausted its supply of newer T-72B hulls, leaving the Defense Ministry with no choice but to dig deeper into the archives. The military officially turned in late 2025 to overhauling these older variants to the T-72B3M standard. They are dragging these aging machines out of mothballs out of pure necessity. The newer reserves simply no longer exist. Factory floors that once focused on modernizing late 80s technology are now stripping down chassis built during the Carter administration, forcing technicians to relearn obsolete mechanical standards. The engineers have to retrofit modern fire control systems into turrets designed before the internet existed. The timeline for the remaining Soviet-era hulls offers little relief for logisticians. OSINT satellite tracking of the Omsk Transmash facility in June 2026 established a strict deadline for the T-80 upgrade program. Analysts estimate a maximum time frame of 12 months before Russia completely exhausts all remaining T-80 stocks available for modernization, forcing a permanent shift in how the military procures its vehicles. That puts the end date squarely in the middle of 2027. The factories will soon have nothing left to refurbish. This means production must shift entirely to newly built chassis. Building a tank from scratch requires far more time and resources than upgrading an existing hull, creating a production bottleneck that threatens to starve the front lines of heavy armor. The impending exhaustion of the T-80 supply creates a strict choke point for deployments. Every single hull pulled from the yard brings the assembly lines one step closer to a complete halt. The refurbishment era is ending. Even the raw numbers of remaining stored vehicles paint a misleading picture of actual combat capacity. Out of the remaining stored tanks, researchers estimate only 851 are actually usable or salvageable. Extreme degradation and heavy cannibalization for spare parts ruined hundreds of chassis sitting in open-air depots. The imagery includes 440 unusable T-64 models. Russian forces cannot easily use those specific vehicles because they are of Ukrainian origin, lacking the necessary replacement parts to keep them running in combat conditions. They do not integrate with current supply chains. Those T-64S will likely rust in place indefinitely. The true number of deployable reserves is far smaller than the raw satellite data suggests, meaning the military possesses less than half the armor that casual observers might assume. Decades of exposure to harsh winters cracked engine blocks and destroyed delicate optics. What looks like a tank from orbit is often just an empty steel shell resting on flat tracks. The armored vehicle shortage mirrors an acute crisis in indirect fire support. During the late summer and early autumn of 2025, OSINT analysts tracked a large outflow of towed artillery from storage bases. Technicians dismantled them for parts, They needed those parts to replace worn-out barrels on active, frontline self-propelled guns. Firing thousands of rounds per week degrades steel rifling rapidly, and manufacturing new artillery tubes requires specialized metallurgy that domestic industry struggles to scale. Cannibalizing towed guns provided a temporary fix. However, it permanently destroyed the donor weapons. The storage yards emptied out to keep the active batteries firing, forcing commanders to accept the permanent loss of their backup firepower just to maintain current operations. A self-propelled howitzer without a functional barrel is just an expensive tractor. The maintenance crews chose to sacrifice the older towed units to keep their mobile artillery in the fight. Ukrainian forces recognized this specific weakness and developed tactics to exploit the barrel shortage directly. In June 2026, Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov announced the success of Operation Artashin. Engineers had developed a specialized munition, specifically engineered to target and crack Russian artillery barrels. The results were devastating. During just 2 nights of operations, these weapons permanently disabled 250 artillery systems, rendering the guns completely unrepairable by bypassing the heavily armored breaches to destroy the most difficult component to replace. This operation accelerated the depletion of fire support at a moment when replacement parts were already scarce. The loss of 250 systems in 48 hours strained the logistics network to its breaking point, proving that precision strikes could dismantle the artillery advantage faster than factories could repair it. The precision of the strikes meant the military could not salvage the damaged equipment. The metal tubes shattered under the impact. The units were left defenseless. If this is interesting, take a second to hit like. It genuinely helps the algorithm show this to more people who need to see it. Feeding the surviving guns requires immense quantities of high explosives, and the domestic supply chain underwent a major transformation. Russia began the full-scale invasion in February 2022 with a strategic pre-war stockpile of 20 million artillery shells, mortar rounds, and rockets. They burned through that entire reserve. This forced a rapid expansion of domestic manufacturing. Factories managed to produce 7 million rounds in 2025, a notable increase from the 1 million rounds manufactured in 2022, proving that the industrial base could scale up when pushed to its limits. That production surge kept the guns firing, but it still fell, short of the peak consumption rates seen early in the conflict. The military had to look beyond its own borders to fill the gap. The volume of artillery fire required to maintain their offensive operations exceeded the maximum theoretical output of their domestic plants, forcing logisticians to seek out international partners willing to sell munitions. The assembly lines ran around the clock. Yet, the front lines always demanded more powder. The search for external ammunition led directly to the Korean Peninsula. Shipping records from 2024 revealed that 52% of the explosive materials sent to the arsenals originated from the North Korean-linked port of Nakhodka. That single statistic highlights a deep reliance on foreign partners to sustain basic combat operations. The domestic factories simply could not mix and pour high explosives fast enough to meet the demand, forcing the government to outsource its most important military requirement to an isolated allied nation. The situation is precarious. Importing more than half of their munitions from a single external source introduces intense strategic risk. If those shipping lanes face disruption, the artillery advantage would collapse almost overnight. The war effort now depends on cargo ships crossing the Sea of Japan. The logistics officers in Moscow traded self-sufficiency for immediate firepower, tying the fate of their ground forces to the uninterrupted flow of maritime traffic from the east. The trains carry their lifeblood. While logisticians scrambled for shells, frontline crews faced an entirely different threat from the sky. In November 2025, reports confirmed units were deploying makeshift vehicles known as turtle tanks, or Tsar Mangol. Crews covered these machines in thick sheet metal shells and strapped electronic warfare systems to the roofs. The primary tactical goal was protecting assault groups from Ukrainian FPV drone strikes long enough to reach enemy lines, prioritizing immediate survival over traditional vehicle aesthetics or standard operating procedures. The improvised armor worked. It succeeded in deflecting small-shaped charges, allowing infantry to dismount near their targets. These unusual modifications emerged as a desperate but functional response to the drone saturation over the battlefield. The metal barns kept the crews alive during the most dangerous phase of an assault. The visual profile of these vehicles caused widespread mockery online, but the infantry riding inside valued the crude protection because it offered a tangible defense against the constant aerial bombardment. The steel absorbed the impacts. Survival came with a cost. The thick modifications heavily restricted turret movement, turning main battle tanks into clumsy armored personnel carriers. A tank crewman interviewed by the outlet Vault 8 in late 2025 detailed the punishing toll the armor took on the hardware. He complained that their homemade shell, constructed from heavy steel cables and metal plates, destroyed the tank's side gearbox. The vehicle failed before it could even drive 10 kilometers, proving that the improvised defenses were ultimately destroying the very machines they were built to protect. The weight crushed the transmissions. This left the tanks immobilized and vulnerable. The crews traded mobility for top-down protection, sacrificing the mechanical lifespan of the vehicle in the process. A broken transmission in the middle of a contested gray zone often proves just as fatal as a drone strike, leaving the occupants trapped inside a stationary metal box while enemy artillery zeroes in on their position. The chassis could not handle the strain, with the Soviet reserves vanishing and improvised solutions destroying active vehicles. The Ministry of Defense finalized a long-term industrial strategy. Leaked Uralvagonzavod factory documents from December 2025 outlined a large, decade-long procurement plan. Russia intends to build 1,783 T-90M tanks and a new variant called the Ryvok 1, or T-90M2, between 2026 and 2036. This document confirmed the official transition away from upgrading legacy hulls toward manufacturing entirely new systems, signaling the definitive end of the Cold War inheritance that sustained the military for decades. The shift is permanent. The factories are currently yielding roughly 240 modern tanks per year to meet this goal. This production rate must sustain the entire armored force once the storage yards are completely empty. The future of ground power relies entirely on this single production roadmap. The defense industry is attempting to turn from a model based on refurbishment to one based on mass manufacturing, a demanding task that requires retooling entire supply chains, while simultaneously fighting a high-intensity conflict. The stakes are absolute. The transition to this next generation of armor starts at a crawl. The leaked documents schedule just 10 T-90M2 units for production in 2026. The entire future of the war hinges on a race against time. The state must scale its domestic production of these modern tanks before it's remaining salvageable. Soviet-era hulls run completely dry in 2027, creating a high-stakes industrial deadline that the factories cannot afford to miss. The clock is ticking. If the factories fail to accelerate their output, the front lines will face a crippling deficit of heavy armor. The era of infinite Soviet stockpiles is over. The conflict is now a pure industrial war of attrition, determined by how fast raw steel can be forged into combat-ready machines. The initial trickle of new variants cannot offset the daily losses experienced on the battlefield, meaning the military will have to fight through a dangerous transitional period with fewer resources than ever before. The weakness is real. If any of this stuck with you, like and subscribe. There's so much more to uncover.